The following episode was originally recorded for a private podcast as part of the Equipped for Life course. It has been edited for public release, but may reference training material from the Equipped for Life course. All right, so we've got Tim and Rachel both here via the phone, and I am here alone in the office. Rachel's not here because he's in Michigan, and Tim's not here because he's super sick and coughing and contagious.
By myself.
Right. So that's why they sound like they do. I've been wanting for us to be able to talk about relational apologetics for a long time. This is one of these subjects I've been thinking about for about 7 years now. I've been thinking a lot about it. I've spoken publicly about it. Some I want to do a lot more in the future, but I'm glad that we can kind of finally get some of the things that we've been thinking about on the table. So it was about 7 years ago that I began thinking about relational apologetics. It kind of started with me thinking or processing about how it seems like usually people don't change their mind in one day. Like all of my outreach experience at that point was pretty much on college campuses talking to people over a 1 or 2 day outreach, usually with Justice for All. I started thinking about, I see people change their minds sometimes in this context, but that's not usually how people change their minds. Like usually it takes a lot longer. And so then I ended up in this private Facebook abortion debate group. I got invited in fairly early, but someone else had started this thing. And so they let in probably 2/3 or maybe even 3/4 pro-choice to 1/4 or 1/3 pro-life. But I was one of the pro-lifers in there. But it went for a year or so. And some of the pro-choice people started becoming my friends. Everything was different. It was something different than I'd ever done before because instead of talking to one person for a couple of hours at the most on a college campus, we were talking basically every day. And I was spending sometimes, as much as an hour or maybe 2 at the most on a daily basis in the group and just getting to know these people. I still remember some of their names. And that experience really affected me. It started getting me kind of thinking about this idea of what if pro-life people and pro-choice people could be friends and be trying to change each other's minds. It helped me to begin humanizing pro-choice people. It helped me to think of them as not avatars, but people with experiences and things that they care about. And so...
Can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Could you try to break down the role of this early experience becoming friends with people in this group and your seeing them as people, not avatars, in comparison with the effect that the outreach experience you had already had was also having on that? Were they playing different roles, or was it all just kind of in the same pot doing the same stuff and it took more time? Does that question make sense?
That's a really good question. I think I don't know. I think outreaches were affecting me in probably a different way. Let me just think about that for a second.
I could take a stab.
Go ahead.
I could let you have a thinking pause.
Go ahead.
Okay. The experience of having conversations with people just one time and never seeing them again is definitely a step up in this is not just an avatar, pro-choice robot. This is an actual person for sure. But I think it makes sense that ongoing relationships, even if they're over the internet, could have a stronger, a more concentrated dose of that effect, at least depending on what kinds of conversations you're having. So just the extended number of conversations with the same people maybe had a stronger impression, but maybe the outreach broke the ice to some extent.
It's possible. It's possible, but I think what's hard for me is I have been doing outreach for quite a while before I got into this Facebook thing. And so I certainly imagine that every outreach probably helps me a little bit in the way that I think about pro-choice people and the way that I think about this issue. But I know that was significantly different for me about this experience. It's what kind of first got me thinking about the idea of, I know Christians a lot of times use the phrase relational evangelism. I didn't want to use that phrase, and so I've been saying relational apologetics, although I know that other people have used that phrase too. So I think the Facebook group had a much greater impact on me, at least thinking about this. And it might have then also helped me to, maybe be friendlier or less weird outreach, or maybe more personable. One of the things that, I know we'll get into this later when we're into tips, but one of the things that was helpful to my experience in the Facebook group was we were purposeful about getting personal in each other's lives. We didn't only debate abortion. We also talked about our favorite movies and TV shows, but also what was going on in our lives. In fact, no one was even allowed to talk about abortion on Fridays. That was like the rule. And I think like that really helped me.
It's like fasting on Fridays in
a
abortion discussion group on Facebook.
It was a hard rule that we stuck to, and we're very purposeful about it because it seemed like it helped everyone on Saturday through Thursday to not be jerks with each other, at least as much, and helped us to get to know each other more. And so that's one of the main things that I've even taken from the group now. I've been in some email discussion and some Skype discussion with some pro-choice people in the last couple of weeks. And even there, like I'm being really intentional about trying to not make it only debate, but trying to, even if it's just little glimpses of getting a sense of kind of who I am as a not pro-life advocate, but as a human being, as a husband, as a father, as a musician or whatever. And hopefully they do the same thing and we're humanizing each other. And then we're also going to have a much better conversation.
Interesting.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So before this Facebook group started, did you have any experience with relational apologetics? Did you have friends that you had met outside of the abortion conversation, found out they were pro-choice, and attempted to talk with them before this? And if that's true, how did those relationships change after you learned from this Facebook group?
I don't remember having conversations with pro-choice friends before that. Like it might have happened.
Okay.
Like there might have been some like maybe early Facebook debate stuff a little bit with people who I would have considered friends, but it certainly would have been like a long-term thing, maybe like a comments thread or something like that, like something that wasn't significant enough for me to still remember. Yeah, I don't remember. Tim,
okay.
do you remember us talking with pro-choice people that we knew in person a lot more than 7 years ago? Well, you and I weren't like talking a whole lot back then either.
Yeah, and those are the dark ages of our relationship, so to speak. When I was in college, I had some pro-choice friends. I had a pro-choice roommate for a year. We would talk about abortion occasionally. Those are probably my earliest days that I can remember of ongoing relationships I had with pro-choice people. So I can't speak for you in that time.
I think I was probably just in too much of a bubble. I don't think I had close pro-choice friends back then. Yeah. I didn't go to college. I was in full-time pro-life work, from, well, basically when I was 18, but paid once I was like 20 or 21. And all my friends at the time were pro-life, and I talked to pro-choice people on college campuses or other outreaches, and that was basically it. I think getting into this group may have been the first time that I was really spending time dialoguing and getting to know pro-choice people on like any kind of level on Facebook or at a personal level like that. And I think that might be why it affected me so much. I really liked it. I felt like now I'm not in this bubble or whatever it is that I had kind of made for myself. It felt more like the way Jesus wants us to live. I'm not trying to be like, I was being like Jesus. I'm not trying to say that. I just like, this feels right. Feels like a good way to live. And in contrast, I was not living at all this way, I think, before that. And I wish I had. But I'm really glad that someone invited me to this group that kind of, threw me into the deep end of the pool where I could have an experience. And, I still think about Jessica sometimes, and Ronnie and Clara and Kara and Kira, sorry, all people that were in the group. And I still remember things about them and what it was like interacting with them. Eventually, the Facebook group basically got too big. It was really great when there was like 30 people or so. And then at some point, like the admins, we didn't have the time to be as involved anymore in kind of helping moderate, and heavy moderation is pretty important in a group like that to pull that off. And then someone invited like 30 or 40 more people, and it just got really bad really fast, and we ended up just closing it down. But I still remember there is something cool about this. And once it was over, it's like, I want to keep doing this. What could that look like? This is something I've been thinking about for about 7 years. And when I think of like things that I want to be thinking a lot about and helping train people in, this is one of those big ones for me. So where Tim is extra trained and equipped in like rigorous philosophy, and Rachel as well. I'm not trained in philosophy, but I've got a passion for spending a lot of time in my life being friends with pro-choice people, trying to figure out what's working and what's not, so I can try to train more people to do that. And I expect down the road for me to have done a lot more of it. But we haven't been able to talk about it yet on the course. And so I kind of want to take a few episodes now and kind of just get on the table some of the things that we've been thinking about to try to be as helpful as we can now. And then as I keep on developing ideas, and I'm sure Tim and Rachel and Jacob, as we keep on kind of thinking about this, can keep adding on to that. And I want to hear from the people who take the course, like tell me about the friendships that you have with pro-choice people, and what is it you're learning? What is making it work? What is making it not work? And so in this first episode, what I want to do is just have us tell stories. In the second part, we're going to make some arguments for why people ought to do this, why you should do this. And we're going to give some practical tips. We've got 12 practical tips right now for doing relational apologetics well. But before we do all that, I kind of want to just get the stories on the table, give kind of a ethos to what it looks like to being friends with pro-choice people. So having said that, I've been talking a lot and I feel kind of uncomfortable. So Rachel, could you tell your first story of doing relational apologetics?
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about Amanda because she and I are still friends. We're still talking. This is an ongoing story, but I kind of want to go back to the beginning and introduce how our friendship turned into a friendship that included relational apologetics.
Awesome.
Because I first met Amanda. She was a neuroscience major. I did neuroscience stuff in my undergrad. And so we had some classes together. We had some mutual friends. So we were the kind of friends in college that you see them at class, you see them a little bit outside of class, you study together. And she got to know me a little bit and I got to know her. And she knew that I was involved heavily with our Students for Life group. She also knew I was a women's studies minor and that I was a Christian. And so all of these things about me were kind of floating around her head and it didn't seem to click for her. She wasn't sure why. So we were the kind of friends in college that studied together. We saw each other in classes and we'd hang out after class once in a while. And Amanda got to know me and I got to know her. And she kind of discovered I was, involved with Students for Life very heavily. I was a women's studies minor and that I was a Christian. And for her, that didn't click very well. She didn't understand why I was studying what I was with the pro-choice classes I was taking, if I was both pro-life and Christian. And she actually brought this up. And I think that's really rare for a pro-choice friend to do, is to start like the relational apologetics. I feel like usually it's going to be the pro-life person initiating, but I could be wrong. And so one day before class, she came up to me and started asking me all of these questions. And Amanda has a lot of deep feelings about the stereotype Christian person. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in our second part when we talk about the tips. But she's had some bad experiences with Christians. And so sometimes she asks me, are you, crazy religious about this thing? Do you have crazy religious ideas about this? So she asked me about like gun control and politics and immigration and like healthcare, a lot of different topics she was asking my viewpoint about. And I felt like when she was doing that in this conversation, this was before class, I felt like she was trying to get somewhere, but she didn't quite go in that area that she was waiting to go. So I kind of did like a meta conversation sort of tactic. I said, can we just pause real quick? I'm getting the fire line of questions and I feel like I'm answering them, but I'm confused as to like where you're going with this. It seems like you want to ask me something, but you're not just going to ask it. So can I like know what that is? And she said, well, I want to know what you think about abortion because you're in this Students for Life group and I don't know what you even do. And I told her that I love talking about abortion. Like that's what I do with Students for Life. I asked her why she wanted to know that. And we talked about women's studies. She had taken a women's studies class at the University of Michigan, and she said that abortion was a topic in that class. And she said she's pro-choice, but the class made her really uncomfortable because it was so biased and so, in her words, like pro-abortion. And she said she'd never heard of people talk about abortion in like such a positive way. And she said she supported a woman's right to choose, but that the actual like topic of abortion made her uncomfortable. She didn't think it was a good thing. And I asked her why. She said that her mother is also crazy religious or worse. And her mother identifies as pro-life, but had considered aborting her. And I felt like that was so helpful for me that she was so open, because if I didn't know that, I think I might have taken that conversation in a different direction. But instead, thanks to her being so honest and vulnerable, I was able to discuss her personal experience and what it's been like with her mom. And this was certainly our first conversation that had even gone this deep, but it wasn't our last. And since then, we've talked a lot about that relationship with her mom and her mom, considering abortion. And she says that sometimes when they fight, her mom will say, I really wish I would have aborted you.
She would say that?
That's deeply hurtful. She said that to my friend.
Wow.
When they're fighting. It's very upsetting to me as a pro-life person to hear that her mother is pro-life, but says things like that to her daughter who's pro-choice.
Yeah.
It just shows what a tangled web this whole topic is. And there's a lot of emotions in there, and I don't know the entire story of that, but what I do know is tragic.
Yeah.
And so Amanda and I that day, we talked about that. And then eventually she came back to a place in the conversation where she wanted to hear an argument for my view, because she's like, I really want to know why you are in Students for Life and why you care so much about this. And so I had a fetal development chart in my backpack. It was actually the ERI brochure.
Of course you did.
And of course I did. And so I bring out the ERI brochure. This is before I was coming on staff. And I bring it out and I show her the fetal development chart, and I kind of talk about personhood and lack of moral difference between the toddler and the embryo and all of this. And then I proceeded to make a equal rights argument. And eventually we looked at graphic images together and kind of had a really long discussion, which kind of got into a little bit of bodily rights, kind of went everywhere. And then it was time for class. So we kind of walked to our seats, still talking, but didn't really quite finish.
How long was that discussion?
And so that was maybe an hour, maybe a little bit longer.
Okay.
It really wasn't that long of a discussion. But then throughout the rest of that semester, I had decided to kind of hold back a little bit. I didn't want to come on too strong and scare her off, because I definitely knew the way she'd been mistreated by like other conservative people that she knew. And so she had a lot of walls up, and she had been so open and vulnerable with me, and I wanted to respect that. So I kind of held back and allowed her to bring it up, because I really felt like she was going to. And she did. She brought up abortion again, another time when we were studying. And that conversation was really brief as far as it was focused on abortion, and very quickly turned into a religious discussion. And Amanda was in the driver's seat the whole time during that second conversation. So she brought up the religion, saying she wanted to talk about what I thought about heaven and hell and God and Jesus and the passion and everything. So we didn't get much studying done that day. And since then, we've gone out to get a drink, and we'll talk about it throughout. And I just kind of want to reflect on a few things that happened in that first conversation, which opened the doors to the rest of this relationship, which honestly has gotten much stronger than before. It's gotten so strong to the point where when I told Amanda what I was doing with my life after college, I told, I'm going to support raise. I'm going to be a full-time pro-life missionary. I told her what Equal Rights Institute does. Her response was, well, how can I help? And I was really shocked by that, because she has changed her mind about abortion since we started talking a little bit, but she does not identify as pro-life. She has moved into a more nuanced position. But I was like, you're pro-choice, and I'm trying to end abortion, right? I'm trying to make it illegal, right? And she's like, well, of course, I know you're trying to do that, and I want you to, be happy. And I'm like, what? But eventually, we're in the spot where I have gotten her permission to tell her story in like speeches and in this podcast. And she's given like a quote on my bio.
Yeah,
Anyway,
like
so
if you go to Rachel's
conversation.
staff page, the page on our leadership team page, it's got her bio. Under her bio is this huge endorsement from her pro-choice friend on how awesome Rachel is. I just think that is the coolest thing.
Like shameless plug, but you know. So the things that happened in that first conversation, which I think have led to where we are now. One, I didn't want to talk at all that day. I'll be honest. I was trying to take a nap when she walked up and I was a little annoyed, honestly, but then I just kind of like surrendered it. And I just like was open to talking with her because she had a very determined look on her face. And so I was open to talking, but I was also prepared for that dialogue to happen if it was going to. Like I did not know it was coming, but I kept the fetal development guide in my backpack in case something would arise. You know, I think as pro-life activists, we should be ready for spontaneous awesomeness at any time. And if a conversation comes to you on a silver platter, like you got to be ready for it. Yeah. And I think there's a level of weird that we don't want to cross.
Yes.
But keeping that in a folder in my backpack definitely, I think, was in the safe territory.
Mm-hmm.
That's great.
So that helped. The other thing was I tried to be the best listener I could. I tried to understand where she was coming from before I like jumped in because I already knew her. I already knew, you know, some things about how she lived her life. I knew that she was very different from me and she thought things that were kind of the opposite of my moral standpoint. And so I didn't want to just like assume how she would handle the situation. So I don't know. Do you guys have any thoughts on
I've got a question.
Story or anything you liked? Sure.
Yeah, I love this story. I would like to hear thousands and thousands of stories just like this. This is awesome. And I love that you talked about how in the beginning you had to be ready for this. You were wanting to take a nap. And she kind of interrupted that. Like, it reminds me of when the three Mormons showed up on my door and I was like totally just wanting to rest. And I was playing video games, but still, like I was not wanting to have a conversation that day at all. And was so annoyed when I opened the door and there's Mormons there. And I'm just like, oh no, you know, I'm glad they were charming and pushy enough to get inside my house. Because at some point, like my attitude changed, and I'm really glad it did. But in the beginning, it was not. It was. I think you had a more open and better attitude than I did. But I've got a different question about the beginning of that, which is, you mentioned how it was your friend who initiated the conversation about abortion with you, and what I want to know is, why do you think it is that she felt safe asking you about that? With me, I've had several cases where the answer is probably different, where both in Andrew's case, and I'm going to talk about Andrew today, but even in one of the most recent conversations I had with someone who, I don't know how the person would identify herself, but in both cases, the reason they reached out was because they watched me on YouTube. Like they saw something about me in the way that I talked about abortion on YouTube and then reached out. I'm guessing that's not what it was for you. So in your case, what is it that you had done before the abortion conversation that made you a safe place for her?
I think she was really curious as to why I am the way I am. I think I didn't quite make sense in the way she like thought about how the pro-life, pro-choice movement works, because some things that she has said to me throughout our conversations, like she'll say, this doesn't make sense because you're really cool. How can you think this?
You were breaking the stereotype.
What does that mean? Yeah, exactly. And I think the women's studies stuff definitely tipped her over the edge. Yeah, I was kind of an anomaly to her. She's like, on one hand, there's this girl that, you know, is really relaxed and in her sweatpants and bun and coming to class with me every day. On the other hand, she's like a devout Christian. How does that make sense? Aren't Christians supposed to wear like hand-spun clothes? I don't know. I don't have anything against that, but I think she has some stereotypes for that sort of like every Christian is a Duggar and they have like 12 siblings. I don't really know. I don't know what she thinks, but I don't think I fit her mold very well.
Yeah.
So I think she was curious. That was like the biggest thing, but also maybe I was a safe safe person to go to talk, just because she maybe suspected I already did that with Students for Life. I'm not sure. I think I was really open about my activism. I would talk about it with friends, even if I didn't know if they're pro-life or pro-choice. I was like, oh yeah, I just came from a Students for Life meeting, or, we had this really cool Students for Life event here. Like, I just talk about it all the time. So I think she kind of knew where I was coming from.
You had lures in the water, like bait ready for them to grab onto if they wanted to.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful.
Do you think there was something about the way also that you had interacted in the women's studies class or classes that sort of exposed this part of you that seems open or thoughtful or open-minded or something like that? Do you think there was some prep work going on there?
Possibly, because she had taken a women's studies class, but not with me. And so maybe she was thinking, well, if I can barely handle this, if I can't even stomach what my professor's saying, how can this other girl do that? And why is she even taking these classes? So that was definitely a pro for me, but I don't know.
I've got a question. The part of the story where like she brought up abortion and ended up pushing a lot on the religious side of it is fascinating to me. So why do you think that was? You said that she knew you were a devout Christian. Why do you think she was so interested in that side of it? And do you think there's anything about your demeanor or anything that you did that made her specifically comfortable coming to you with those questions?
Like asking me if I was a crazy religious person?
Is that what she asked?
Is that what you mean? Yeah, that was her first words. She said, "Are you a crazy religious person?" And I said, "Do you mean I'm Catholic?" She's like, "Yeah, that's what I meant." I'm like, "Okay, yeah, I guess." But I think that's mostly from her personal experiences. She had a roommate that like tried to force her to be baptized and was really aggressive. I think they were trying to be evangelistic, but they ended up coming off as very pushy. And that was a big turnoff to her. On the other hand, I would talk about my faith in a very opposite way without watering it down. And so I think she was interested. But mostly I think it's from her personal experience. I don't know if it's tied to the abortion topic or not.
Interesting.
That's awesome. I've got a feeling that as I hear more stories about people doing this, that this thing of the other person, the pro-choice person, was able to tell that this pro-life person was different than the caricature they had in their mind. I bet that's going to be a really common one. I think that's awesome.
Yeah. I hope so.
I'll talk about Andrew, and then I also want us to play the clip of Emily talking about her friendship. But certainly of the pro-choice friendships that I've talked about in public, Andrew is the one that I've talked about the most often. I'll just say real quick, there's a little bit of a difficulty in telling the story of my friendship with Andrew. And the reason is because when Andrew and I first became friends, Andrew's name was Deanna. And Andrew identified himself or herself to me as a lesbian woman. And almost all of the pro-life action, when we were talking about abortion and eventually Andrew having kind of this process of going from pro-choice to identifying as pro-life, like that entire time, this was someone that I called Deanna and who identified as a woman. And now Deanna's name is Andrew. And Andrew's going through a process and identifies as a transgendered person. And that makes things a little bit difficult. I don't really mind using Andrew's name Andrew because people can change their names, but I'm still trying to figure out how to deal with the pronoun issue. I want to be really, really respectful to transgendered people who I think are probably some of the most hurting people on the planet. And when I think about like the suicide rate of transgender people, I'm just very, very concerned and sympathetic for people who are transgendered. But then at the same time, I still have differing views about what's going on there, like metaphysically, than most people in the transgender community. And so it's kind of hard to walk this line. There's a part of me that just wants to use male pronouns because certainly that is the more, I think, polite thing to do here. Certainly what I do when Andrew and I talk. I'm also concerned about implying that I believe things that I don't. And so I'm still trying to figure all of that out. For the sake of today, because I think it's important to tell the story, I'm going to basically try to avoid pronouns as much as I can and just say Andrew's name. So I'm going to say Andrew's name an uncomfortable number of times or awkward number of times, not the way most people would tell a story, just because it's the best thing that I know to do right now, trying to kind of walk this line of being kind of respectful and and also not make a statement about transgenderism, which is not something that I really want to do. Our friendship began because Andrew reached out to me and sent me an email through the kind of the YouTube private message system after watching some of the Life Report episodes that we had done about bodily rights. This was right around the time, or a little bit after the time, where Tim and Steve Wagner and Trent Horn and a couple of other people and I had spent around 2 years privately discussing bodily rights arguments. This is where the de facto guardian argument came to be. And I was certainly thinking about bodily rights a lot more often. I don't think we talked about de facto guardian, but I think we had done kind of a general episode about bodily rights arguments, probably just explaining like sovereign zone and right to refuse as different categories or something. And Andrew had watched those and was pretty interested. Andrew was very pro-choice, identified as a pro-choice atheist lesbian in Canada. And bodily rights arguments were a really important part, by far the most important kind of core of Andrew's pro-choice views. Andrew had a pro-choice blog. I think it was called Restraining the Violinist, if I remember right. The violinist was in the name. It was a really interesting pro-choice blog that I enjoyed reading. Anyway, I got this like essay through the YouTube private message system. There's like, here's why I'm pro-choice and can we talk about it? And I was impressed. I was impressed with how the essay was written. I still have it. I replied and said, I'd love to talk to you about this, and tried to keep it kind of short. I didn't respond to like everything in that message, but kind of picked one or two things and kind of offered some thoughts. And we pretty quickly transitioned over to standard email just because the YouTube private message and comment system is really flaky. And I just wanted to make sure that we didn't like miss each other's emails and stuff. So at some point we switched over to just like a standard email. And a friendship began. Andrew had a pretty big change over the course of about 127 emails. Well, it wasn't about, it was exactly 127 emails. I counted. And in that process, in that email exchange, it wasn't as personal. Certainly there were little personal things going on, but for the most part, this was where a lot of the kind of philosophy debate happened. And recently I kind of reviewed all of those emails and I made a list of the topics that we talked about. So in those 127 emails, we talked about Eileen McDonough and her pro-choice argument. We talked about bodily rights arguments. We talked about rape. We talked about the concept of intrinsic human value, concepts of harm, concepts of taking away dignity of people in temporary comas, moral objectivism versus utilitarianism. We talked about stem cell research. We talked about that after the afterbirth abortion paper, back to bodily rights arguments, and then standing up for people on the other side of the debate who are being ridiculed by people on your own side, followed by post-abortion syndrome and the use of graphic pictures. So there's a lot that happened.
Just a little bit of light reading material.
Yeah, right. Every once in a while I was going to Tim, like, as sometimes this is going a little bit over my head. It's like, hey, help me. I want to make sure that I'm handling this well. So Tim was certainly helping me out on the philosophy side. But I think a lot of times, every day there'd be a new email or maybe several emails going back and forth. And then after 127 emails, we began Skyping. We've sent almost no email since. We almost only Skype or Zoom or whatever. That really helped. It really affected the dialogues. It was a lot easier to do that thing where I'm trying not to just be a pro-life avatar and be a person when we were on Skype.
When I hear 127 emails, I'm thinking that's a lot of writing. That's a lot of back and forth. Did you get exhausted while you were trying to do that? And is that one of the reasons you switched over to Skype, or was it mainly to have more of a face-to-face connection?
I think it was more the latter. I'd have to go back. It's been a little while since I went over them, and certainly I still have a copy of everything, so I could go over and look. But I think it was, certainly they were long emails, essay kind of, or blog post, kind of emails that we were both writing. I suspect it had a lot more to do with wanting to get face-to-face, if I remember right. Because at the time, I was doing pro-life work. I was full-time pro-life, but I don't think it was, I'm sick of writing these, 1,000-word emails. I think it was more like at some point, it just seemed obvious that if we were both fine with doing Skype, not only would we cover more ground quickly, but that of course it would be more personable. If I could have been meeting with Andrew at Starbucks, we would have. It's just that the whole thing of Andrew living in Canada has made it difficult. And so because we didn't expect to be able to meet each other anytime soon, it's like, well, let's do kind of the middle option. Like the best that we can do is jump to Skype. And it was awesome. once we were in Skype, we were spending even more time talking about our personal lives and less time debating abortion. Well, certainly we were still talking about abortion, but Andrew was asking me about my wife and my kids, and was there to walk with me through the highs and lows of launching a nonprofit eventually. I was there talking to Andrew about the time that Andrew moved out of Andrew's parents' house, there to process after the death of Andrew's grandmother and kind of grieve with Andrew about that. Certainly we talked about other issues like same-sex marriage, as you can probably imagine, and have very open and frank conversations that were very productive and helpful to both. And so there's an interesting kind of a shift that happened where while I was trying to have things be somewhat personable in the emails, it was a lot easier to do that. We did that a lot more once we were on Skype. So I'll kind of fast forward a little bit. I think it's something like 12 or 14 months into the friendship when Andrew sends me an email or a text or something saying that Andrew has signed up for the Canadian March for Life, to go to the Canadian March for Life. Like there's a national, this is like the equivalent of the DC March for Life in Canada. And I was really surprised by that. This was the first time that Andrew indicated becoming pro-life or wanting to join up and do pro-life events. Certainly I had seen some shift in Andrew's position on abortion, but this was a significant one. And so naturally I kind of asked why, like what's going on? And Andrew said that Andrew's going to start self-identifying as pro-life. And I said, what did it for you? Like, what's the thing? Like, this is a big threshold that had been crossed. And it was two things. Andrew said that Andrew knew that my arguments had won really decisively. And that was really, really important. But then it was also really important that we were friends, because after Andrew had worked out my arguments were the ones that had won the day, after all of this debate, Andrew went through several weeks of fear of what would happen if Andrew publicly began self-identifying as pro-life. Because Andrew's entire community, besides me, were not only pro-choice, but they're gay rights advocates. So it's like, the way Andrew described it later to me was like, would it be this thing where if Andrew says on Facebook, starts posting pro-life memes or something like that, or articles, would all the friendships go away, basically? Would Andrew be shunned, basically, by the entire community that Andrew had around? And it took several weeks of trying to kind of work out, and ultimately just what happened, the way Andrew said, was that at some point, Andrew realized that even if Andrew's friends all shunned him, that Andrew still had this one friend on the other side of the fence that would, kind of have open arms, right? That it would be okay. It wouldn't be a completely friendless life, even for a while. There would be at least one person there, and that was enough. That was sufficient to cause the courage that it took for Andrew to do the next thing, which was go to the March for Life. I remember we were texting during the March for Life, which was helpful for Andrew because the March for Life is not the most welcoming place for people who are not Catholic pro-lifers, like very, very religious, because there's crucifixes everywhere, there's crosses everywhere. It's a very, very religious event, or at least tends to be a very religious event. I think it's getting a little bit less so. But I remember Andrew being pretty uncomfortable and feeling very, very much like, being on an island at this March for Life. And I'm sure part of that was also like, this is all kind of new. But we were texting kind of during that event, and it was the closest I could be to being there with Andrew for that. And Andrew later described, like, as far as the arguments, because I've been asked several times, like, what were the arguments that made the change for Andrew? And what Andrew said was, it was realizing there's a big difference between letting someone die and actively killing a human being was really important. Because remember, Andrew was coming from like purely a bodily rights argument. It wasn't a problem of thinking the embryo is not a person. It was completely bodily autonomy stuff. And so Andrew came to believe that dismembering an unborn child is a serious violation of bodily autonomy. I had even pushed Andrew, like, it was fairly...
Sorry. You said dismembering an unborn child is a serious violation of bodily autonomy?
Yes. That was the way Andrew described.
You mean the unborn's bodily autonomy?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
That's my bad.
This is a response to bodily rights that we emphasize, but it's the argument that Andrew described, like coming to believe, that was really, really significant in that process. I remember this early part of the debate where we talked about personhood and we got past it pretty quick because Andrew said, yeah, I'm convinced the zygote is human being. And I really put, it's like, really? Do you really believe that? Are you sure? Like, maybe you think it's like a golden retriever. Do you think it's like kind of valuable, but not totally? Like, do you really believe, I actually said, like, do you really believe like a zygote at the one-celled stage, when it is a distinct living organism, you think it is morally equal to a toddler? And Andrew said, yes. So it's a very unusual kind of dialogue where we could completely sort of table that. We were completely on the same page on personhood, and it was bodily autonomy that we spent most of our time talking about. There's one other thing that Andrew later described as being really important to that process, which was thinking about Andrew's sister who has Down syndrome and realizing that many babies with Down syndrome are aborted really had a strong effect on Andrew and eventually caused this change to happen.
Beyond the arguments that convinced Andrew to change their mind, what other things did you do that were helpful?
I think, again, it was also being a good friend. Something I've described when talking about like relational apologetics is a cool thing happens when you spend a lot of time with someone is hopefully they come to know at least two things about you. To know that you're both intelligent or thoughtful and virtuous. A good person, not a hater of women or like something like that. And I think when someone learns both those things about you, they make a very powerful chord. Your arguments now carry a lot more weight. And from what I understand about Andrew's process, it was really a combination of the two. Andrew once described there being two necessary conditions for the conversion to happen, which was rigorous philosophical arguments and a loving friendship with someone on the other side. So I'm not sure all the different things that I did that were helpful to Andrew, but it seems like it was a combination of having really good responses to the philosophical concerns. Again, like it was so good that we had done all the Facto Guardian work before our email debate, because that's what Andrew needed, or was a lot of what Andrew needed. Even though I don't know that Andrew agrees with like everything in the DFG paper or the way that
I
we
don't
think
agree
about
with everything in the DFG paper.
Yeah, we at some point
it was a great part of the process.
It was. And at some point we'll do some kind of an update podcast or something, and we can kind of talk about differences between, the DFG paper and where like you and I are now. I had thoughts, and sometimes I was sharing Tim's thoughts too, that Andrew had never considered from the pro-life side. And so Andrew was surprised by kind of new pro-life arguments, new pro-life information that was not expected. This is one of the reasons why I care so much about helping pro-life people with like, what are the most persuasive arguments? Is I don't care as much that you know one argument for the fetal personhood. Do you know the one that makes the most sense to pro-choice people? Because certainly, at least in Andrew's case, I don't think this is true in every case. I think Andrew cared more about the arguments than some of my other pro-choice friendships. Certainly in the case of Ronnie, and I'll tell that story later. For Andrew, a lot of what Andrew cared about was the philosophy of figuring out, like, we both really cared about being on this journey for truth together. I said sometimes like, look, we're both open-minded and we're both thoughtful and we're both willing to be friends together and keep talking about this until somebody wins. Like one of two things is going to happen. Either I'm becoming pro-choice or this person's becoming pro-life, because we're not going to give up. We're going to keep trying to figure it out. And at some point, someone is going to figure out the other person has a worldview that makes more sense, and then some kind of a change is going to happen.
I have a question, Josh.
Yeah.
This could be like an abyss of a conversation that we could probably spend a lot of time in, and that's not what I want us to do.
Yeah.
But I want to get a quick sense from you on whether you still kind of agree with the framework that you described. Hey, there's only two options because we're both smart and thoughtful and open-minded, and we're going to be friends together, something like that. Because of these, like this set of things, eventually one of us is inevitably going to change their mind on the question. Do you still believe that that's true? Do you think that if two people have those set of qualities, does that mean that on any topic, or maybe just on the abortion topic or something like that, that means that eventually one of them will have to change their mind?
No, I think it's a little bit simplistic. I think I was being simplistic in talks when I said that, because there's obviously also, third and fourth and fifth options. There are ways that this could have turned out where neither of us changed our mind, because ultimately there were other things going on for us psychologically that were causing us to believe the things that we believe. I'm guessing you can even think of some other cases too where there could have been a result of all of this.
Okay, just checking.
Well, that was sort of a leading question. Did you have others that you want to throw out?
I don't think we need to delve too deeply into it. I believe that persuasion is a really complicated topic, and the kinds of things that play into why people believe what they do is certainly arguments matter, open-mindedness matters, virtue, like intellectual virtue matters.
Yeah.
But my current pretty strong leaning is that two equally intelligent and equally intellectually virtuous people could talk about a given issue for 10,000 hours and never change each other's minds because of the kinds of emphasis that they place on particular aspects of the discussion. So I think the abortion question is more likely than many to result inevitably eventually change mind because of the way the aspects of the abortion debate go. But something like theological discussions would be an example that I'm thinking about recently. I think really, really brilliant people can argue for a million years on any number of a given theological subjects, and based on their religious experiences or the role of how they've been raised might play into it, or a number of other things, can ultimately both people could wind up completely reasonable and virtuous, but still disagreeing.
I 100% agree with all of that. And I was just thinking of the psychology of persuasion in a more simplistic way than I do now that we've had a lot of those conversations and more experiences like that. So I'm totally on the same page with you, Tim.
Okay.
To make a long story shorter, there's a really cool moment after Andrew went to the March for Life. Andrew had made a shirt. It just gotten a plain white shirt and grabbed a black Sharpie and wrote something like the equal rights argument on it. It said, I think, and in big letters, it's human because its parents are human. It's alive because it's growing, and all humans should have an equal right to life. What do you think? And then after going to the March for Life, came home, stood in front of a full-length mirror, and took a picture, like a phone picture, and posted that picture on Facebook. And we've both described that as sort of Andrew came out of the closet for the second time in Andrew's life at that moment. It was a very, very brave thing I think Andrew did. And thankfully, Andrew didn't lose all of the other friendships. Certainly raised a lot of eyebrows and caused a lot of debates to start happening. But Andrew actually started converting some of Andrew's pro-choice friends to pro-life after that. It was this huge change. I think there's something kind of similar to like with Rachel, where Rachel would just naturally talk about pro-life work because that's a very important and kind of significant part of Rachel's life right now, is getting ready to go into full-time work. And so suddenly this was a significant thing going on for Andrew. And so abortion conversations became a very organic, natural thing for some of those friends in that circle, and some of them actually also changed to pro-life, which was really cool. Ultimately, we got to both speak together at the University of Portland. This university kind of heard the story and asked us to come and do a talk together, and we did. And it was great to finally be able to be in the same place and spend some time together prepping for that event and talking about other issues like same-sex marriage. And Andrew gave me a really good book on the topic of same-sex marriage, and this is a really good time. We continue to talk. We're still very, very close friends, and that's the best story that I have about relational apologetics. I want to jump to the Emily interview. So some of you listening to the podcast will recognize Emily Faulkner's name, because Emily Faulkner is the Students for Life leader at CSU who had invited me to do a talk on bodily rights arguments last fall, and the university denied funding for it because, as they said in an email, they weren't convinced that everyone in the audience would feel affirmed by me because it's a controversial topic. So there was a lawsuit that C and ADF did against CSU, and I can now give the update that they won that lawsuit. It was a big victory. CSU has completely taken down that diversity grant thing that they were only giving to certain people on certain sides of issues. So that was a good victory for free speech and everything there.
Yay.
When I first met with Emily, like right before the event, Emily and then like the VP of the club and I grabbed dinner before the speech, and Emily was just sharing about how C had been doing relational apologetics. And one of the stories especially was just a fantastic story about what we want to get at. And so before today, like Tim and I had actually already recorded an interview that we did with Emily telling her story. It's 17 minutes long, but it is fantastic. This totally gets at the ethos of what I care about pro-life people doing. So you're going to hear Emily tell her story, and you're going to hear Tim and I kind of interact with her and ask her some follow-up questions to better understand the story. Every once in a while, you're going to hear Emily refer to a second story. She ultimately told us 2 stories. I cut the second one just for the sake of time. The first story is a lot more instructive, and it's 17 minutes long, which I know is long. It's going to be kind of a long episode, and sorry, we want to tell some good stories. So without further ado, this is us interviewing Emily Faulkner about her doing relational apologetics. So we have Emily Faulkner from Colorado State University on. If you recognize Emily's name, it's probably because you've seen her on our Facebook, because she's literally suing her campus. Because I went last fall to do a bodily rights speech for Emily and her awesome club, and then the club denied funding because
the university.
The university denied funding. And Emily, remind us again the 2 reasons that the campus said they didn't want to fund the speech.
Yeah, so the email they sent said that the content of the speaker does not appear entirely unbiased as it addresses the issue of abortion. That was number 1. And then the second one was that people would not necessarily feel affirmed in attending the event, as if they could preemptively tell me that people wouldn't feel affirmed. So
what kind of proof is necessary for one to be believed to be quote unquote entirely unbiased and entirely affirming?
And that's the problem, is that we have this diversity grant, and the purpose is to raise awareness of differing perspectives, and that's found on the website. Yeah. That's their purpose. And then they say, well, we can't give you money because it's not entirely unbiased. Well, that's the purpose of your entire program.
Yeah.
Is the diversity.
Welcome
grant.
To the diversity. We're the pro-lifers. We're the diversity.
Welcome to diversity, where diversity is not accepted.
Yeah. Anyway, but that's not the reason we're having Emily on today. We might do a follow-up and talk about that once the lawsuit is over or something like that later. But we wanted to do was when I was in town, was able to have a lovely dinner with Emily and another one of the student leaders. I don't remember who.
Yeah, Hannah.
And we started we got to talking about relational apologetics, and you started telling me stories about doing relational apologetics, which always excites me. Whenever I hear about other people doing this, I don't feel like I've made this thing up. There's other people that have been doing this, but whenever I hear about people doing it, I get really, really excited. And so I would love for you to just tell. I don't remember if you told me multiple stories or one. I remember at least one amazing story, but I would just love to hear you talk about your experiences doing relational apologetics, cultivating friendships with pro-choice people.
Absolutely. So I actually have a couple of different experiences. The first
Awesome.
one that I came across was I was on a research trip in Mexico last summer, and I had a group of people that I was kind of familiar with, not really. Became friends with one of these girls, really good friends with her, and I had known that she's kind of a feminist, pro-choice, but we were actually sharing a room together, roommates, and we got to know each other. And she kind of found out I was pro-life, and where my views were on that, and I found out, she's kind of pro-choice. She's the nicest person I've ever met, though. Very kind-hearted and gentle and compassionate. And towards the end of the trip, she goes, "Emily, I need to tell you something," because we had finally started opening up. And she says, I had an abortion a few years ago. And she's like, "I didn't know if I could tell you this because, I know you're pro-life. I know you have those stances." And the first thing I said was, "Are you okay?" And I immediately just gave her a hug, because I think that's immediately what she needed, was the compassion from me and not any sort of judgment.
Yes.
And I think that was the first step in her kind of seeing a light, like I was like a lighthouse to her, and kind of a refuge for her, this compassionate source for her. So we just continued building our relationship, became really good friends. And over the course of time, I was able to help her find, post-abortive care and healing. And she kind of still held these pro-choice views, but she gave me a call one night and she said, "Emily, because you showed me so much love and because of what you do as a pro-life activist, I have decided that I am pro-life." She threw away all of her she threw away all of her Planned Parenthood shirts. She just was like, "This is just miraculous." She's like, "I'm not going to take birth control anymore."
Wow.
And now she's like an active, vocal member of the pro-life movement. And I think she's getting to the point where she's going to be able to share her story with people. Just recently, she opened up with me. She had she shared her personal experience with me, going through the abortion and everything leading up to that and everything after. And that was a very like emotional and personal thing for her to share with me. And she didn't cry when she was telling me, but I cried for her. But I think she'll be able to, and I've suggested this to her, but when she becomes comfortable with it, like sharing her message to other people to prevent women from having to deal with the same pain. So she just said, I'm pro-life because of you, and I thank you so much for that, just because you were compassionate to me. So I think the lesson to be learned from that is just that if we can just show love, we will be able to change people's hearts and cause them to be voices, a voice for other people. That was probably the biggest one.
Yeah. So stop there, because I've got multiple follow-up questions for you about
absolutely.
this. Because I want everyone to have a fuller picture of what this looked like. I think it's really clear that you truly love this person and did a really good job of showing compassion to her, showing her that you're not this pro-life jerk. You're a safe place for her to go to and share this part of her. So one of the things I'd like to hear from you, just real quick for context sake. So how far into the friendship before she told you that she was post-abortive, and also how far into the friendship before she changed to pro-life?
Yeah, so it was about, I was acquaintances with her before we had all gone to Mexico. We were in Mexico for a month. Okay. And I would say about 2.5 weeks in, maybe 3 weeks in to the trip, that's when she said, she opened up to me about it. Wow. So I was able to just kind of comfort her there. And I think it was, that was July, August. So a few months later, she called me and said, I'm pro-life. And I can't believe, I ever thought that Planned Parenthood was good and all this stuff. So it didn't really take much time. And all it took for me was, it was fast because I kept up with her. I texted her. I said, hey, do you want to meet up? Do you want to talk about things? And we wouldn't even always just talk about pro-life stuff. We just talk and be friends. And I always said hey, I have this resource for you for free counseling. I'd love to give it to you. And same thing with her fiance. I said, I would love to help you guys both. And just constantly being there for her and letting her know that I was there for her and that there was no judgment on my side, I think really helped her quickly develop that.
Can you tell why I was really excited when I was having dinner with Emily?
This is amazing. It's a wonderful story.
You about freaked out, Josh.
Talk to me a little bit about how often you like when you were together, what is the ratio roughly of how often you guys were talking about abortion or other things that you disagreed on versus times where you're having more kind of, there's this common ground talking about things that you agreed on, or just being friends?
Yeah. So I would say the entire time there was no really it was never a crazy, because I've had some serious encounters between pro-life and pro-choice. So it was never really that. It was more of me just kind of listening to her. And just reminding her that I was there for her. And we kind of would touch, she just kept saying, I can't believe you were so open to me. And I would kind of she would listen to me as well. And I would just kind of let her know, what we do in the pro-life movement. We don't just love the baby, we love the woman as well. And I made that clear to her that I wanted to help her. And that, it's okay because her baby is in heaven and that she, her baby loves her, and that's okay. And I think that really went through to her. So it was never really a debate. I think it was just mutual listening, and caring for each other. And we always, she's just, like I said, she's just a very kind soul. Yeah. One of the sweetest people I know. So I think she's just very tender hearted, and she was very open to that. So,
So what I hear you saying is we talk about this in the course. People are complicated. There are lots of different types of pro-choice people, not just 3 of them or whatever. It sounds like this girl didn't have a lot of strong philosophical arguments for being pro-choice. You guys never had to debate bodily rights arguments or something like that. It sounds like this was a relationship where you were showing her what it looks like to be a loving pro-life person. Here's what the pro-life movement actually is. Here's what we actually care about. And that's all it took for her.
Yeah, which is surprising because I think nowadays it takes a lot more for people I need science to back this up. I need philosophy. I need something more than just you being kind to me. But that's literally all it took, and which is surprising because if pro-lifers could just recognize that, women need mercy too, even after an abortion. Imagine how many people we could get to become spokespeople for the pro-life movement. Yeah. That's really all it takes was just being compassionate and loving.
So I'm fascinated by the fact that you didn't need to make arguments to her. Like, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
And so like there's kind of a natural narrative that's coming to my mind about this from what you said that I want to kind of run by you and have you tell me if I'm on the right track or on the wrong track, which is that because she viewed pro-life people as being uncompassionate, she didn't feel like she needed to take the pro-life view seriously. And once you change that, like, she didn't have to think that much about it because you said, she said she couldn't believe that she was ever pro-choice or okay with Planned Parenthood, which seems like that indicates she didn't think that thoroughly about like that side of the issue. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a common theme today among a lot of young women is that there's really no time taken in taking a stance on this issue. You know, it's just automatically like, oh, Planned Parenthood's good, or oh, I'm pro-choice, it's fine, whatever. But then, and I think like when she initially told me she had an abortion, she told me she was very scared to tell me because she was afraid that I'd be mad at her or something. And I think that's also a common theme is that people are afraid that pro-life people are automatically going to be, you know, judgmental or angry. But the reality is that we're not. Yeah. And so literally all it took was some compassion and love on my side and resources offered to her and reminding her that life does begin at conception for her to realize, oh, yeah, pro-life people aren't that bad and I could be one of them too.
Wow.
Yeah.
I've got another specific question I want to ask. So the point where you offered her resources, like to get healing, could you go into more detail on like how you played that out? Like I'm thinking like particularly in the context of a relationship, how you like certainly if you have a post-abortive friend, you want to offer them resources, but in a non-pushy, like clearly you've got a problem and you need some help. Let me give you the help. So that's the obvious dumb version. What's the good version that you did?
Right. Yeah. It's a very slippery slope. It's hard because it's a very delicate matter and you want to handle it delicately. So I prayed a lot before it, but I had a friend who does counseling and she said, I'd be willing to let your friend, you know, have free counseling. And this is something we had discussed before. And I made it clear to her. I said, I know that having an abortion it's not something that is normal. It's not something that can make you feel good. I don't know how you're feeling, but if you're willing to tell me how you're feeling, I'd love to listen. So I kind of opened myself to listening how she felt. And when she told me that it wasn't good, you know, there have been some problems. And I came across this, you know, one of my friends at church who gave me her card. I said, hey, you know, I have a friend at church and she said that she'd be willing to give you some free counseling if you would like, you know, and I wasn't like, you have to do it. It was not like, it was very non-push. It was just out in the open. Here's it for you. I gave you the information. Now it's your turn to take it and run with it if you would like to. And then from then I said, I checked up on her. Hey, how are you feeling? Or, you know, are you doing better? And things like that. Nothing, I never brought up counseling again. I just said, you know, just little things. It's definitely hard because it is delicate, but I think she realized that it was compassion. So.
I've got two quick follow-up questions before we move on to your other story.
I have one more as well.
Okay. So one is, do you think that the fact that you guys were on this intensive month-long trip to Mexico is one of the reasons that, in a sense, like do you think that fast-tracked you to having kind of a very close friendship with this person?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, living with someone for a month can definitely do that, can really expedite the process. And I mean, and she's a little bit older than me too, so I think, and that might have been a barrier. But I think when you're with someone and around them pretty much 24/7, that can always make it faster. But I think even if we hadn't, I think that helped us get to know each other better. But I think even if we hadn't been in that situation, maybe if we'd just been working together in a lab or something. My political views always come out. My pro-life views always come out.
This is true.
I think somehow, you know, we would have been able to connect, but I really do. I'm very thankful for that trip to Mexico because I do think that being able to be around her and us being together for so long enabled her to, you know, kind of find at least a little bit of trust in me to be able to open up to me about that, even though she had some preconceived notions about maybe me being judgmental or things like that. So
and remind me, I'm sorry if you already said what exactly is it that you guys were doing in Mexico?
It's a research trip, I think.
Oh, so we were both working for one of the professors here, Dr. Brown, and we were working on a cancer cure acute lymphoblastic leukemia. So went to Mexico. CSU has some like facilities down there, and so we just went down there to do some research.
That's cool.
Gotcha. And one more question from me on this. Yeah. So I'm thinking about the student in the Students for Life video that we played in Module 9 who was talking about how like she was really intentional. She was reaching out to this friend of hers like often, like I think at least once a week or something like that, like touching base with her. And I felt like I heard that in your story too. Mm-hmm. Did you have a sense of kind of how often you were trying to reach out and connect with your friend?
Yeah. So every time I would think about her, I would text her because I know sometimes I get a little busy. But I mean, it would be about once a week, maybe once every couple of weeks. But, we're always in touch somehow. Maybe it's over Facebook. Mm-hmm. It may not be like a direct text, but there's always some sort of communication going on, or like Snapchat, or like, hey, we're watching The Bachelor at my house. Come on over. Just little things like that. Like, hey, do you want to meet up? And then like, when she had told me that the anniversary of her abortion was coming up, I wrote a reminder in my phone. And I set an alarm. That way I would be reminded that, okay, this day, 3 years ago, she was supposed to, she would have a little kid now. And so I texted her, I said, hey, I just want you to know I love you, and that I know this day might be hard for you and your fiance, but I'm here for you if you guys ever need anything, and just know that I love you both. And that was literally all it took. And I think that might have like helped her through the day a little bit. So
good.
That's wonderful.
So good.
Yeah.
Where's your last question?
Okay, so last question on this one is,
yeah.
So we've been talking recently on our podcast about we don't want to be results oriented. And so you have clearly this was very successful and awesome. Do you think you made mistakes? Are there things that you would have done that you wish you had done differently, even though like ultimately things came out well?
I don't know, because I think my mindset through this entire thing wasn't, oh, I'm going to win someone over for the pro-life movement. I never thought about that.
Good.
It was always like her as a person, how is she feeling? And I think what came about that is she might possibly be a really awesome advocate and a vocal advocate for the pro-life movement. But that in the beginning and all throughout the process, I never was like, oh, we won one over. It's not about winning people over. It's about changing people's hearts and making sure that they're okay. And I think that being my mindset was just in the right place. So I'm not sure if I would ever do anything over.
This is awesome. Thank you so much, Emily, for coming on and sharing these stories. This gives us lots to think about. So you're awesome. Keep up the awesome work.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, you. Emily. Bye.
See ya.
And there you go.
What a great contrast to the story you just told about Andrew, because on one hand, we had the argument-driven conversion, and here we had definitely a pure relational, this girl needed a friend.
Right.
I just got to say, like, I hadn't listened to that before, and I'm like Emily's new fangirl. I just added her on Facebook. I'm going to confess. She sounds great. I'm so happy to hear the story.
Yeah, she's awesome. It is interesting to me as think about the different stories, and there's something similar with my story about Ronnie. It's so different from what was helpful for Andrew versus what was going on with Emily versus what's been going on with you and Amanda. It's like these stories are not all the same, which is why I think it's valuable to tell more than one story about it. Is these stories are going to be varied because people are varied and complex, and so there's a lot we can learn from, I think, different stories.
Super varied, like opposite ends of the spectrum.
Every spectrum. Awesome. Lots and lots of different spectrums in 3D space. Yeah. Rachel, you had another story. If you could tell that real quick, and then I'll close with the Ronnie story, and then I know Tim had a couple of kind of general questions.
Sure. So this story is a lot quicker than the Amanda story. My friends and I often would go to this like hipster bar in like downtown Ann Arbor. They have like half off certain beers on Monday nights. And so we would go, and this is like a group of Catholic friends who are very like-minded, would all get together and meet. And so one night I go, and I had met this guy, we're going to call him John, a couple times before this, but I didn't know him very well. I didn't have a very good rapport. We weren't very close friends. We were more acquaintances. And one night we're all sitting around, and my friend had come. I hadn't seen them in a while. And they were asking what I was up to, how my work was going. And so I start talking about my pro-life work, and they didn't really know what ERI did. So I was walking through and I explained exactly what ERI's vision is and what I'm going to be doing. And so I'm telling my friend this, and I kind of had the attention of the group of people there. There were like 8 of us, and John is listening in. And I know all of the other people are Catholic and pro-life, but I didn't know where he stood on anything really. And so kind of after giving my long-winded explanation of everything going on with me, I turned to him and I was trying to be polite. So I said like, hey, I actually don't know what you think about all this. Can you help me out? Where do you kind of stand on this issue? And he said, well, I'm actually pro-choice. And I was like, really? Well, I mean, you just heard me talk about how I love to talk with pro-choice people. And I definitely try to open-mindedly seek to better understand. Would you mind if I like ask you some more questions so I can like know where you lie? And I grabbed my beer and I said, would it be like super awkward if I came down and sat by you? Because he was on the other end of the table, like down. And there's like an empty seat across from him. So I like moved seats. And the reason I like worded it that way was because I didn't want to come off as aggressive.
Right.
I'm definitely not an aggressive person,
Charge!
But that move could be perceived as like, oh, you're pro-choice, honing missile coming at you now.
Right.
Because he just heard I'm a professional pro-life person. Like I'm going to be full-time, like all of this. He just heard me say that. And so I didn't want it to be aggressive.
Gauntlet down.
Right, exactly. And so I came over and we ended up talking for the next hour or more about abortion. And it was just him and I. And I want to point out another thing that would have happened, like, could this have gone very differently? I think it would have gone very badly, because if I had just asked him that across the table and tried to have that dialogue, it would have been him and like 7 pro-life people in this conversation. And I didn't want that, because that would have made the defenses go even more up. That would have been really unfair. And so I definitely tried to move it to a dialogue between him and I. And since then, we've seen each other, and I think he was like almost afraid that when I saw him next, I would like jump right back into where we were in the discussion, because it definitely was philosophically argumentative based. It wasn't a whole lot of like personal, relational storytelling sort of thing. But the time I saw him after that, I didn't mention the abortion thing again. And since then, we've kind of talked about it. And he's still not a great friend of mine. I don't see him that much, but it's definitely been friendly. And he's had some like follow-up discussion points, and he asked me how pro-life stuff's going. And so we're definitely like developing that friendship. But the reason I share the story is because the one thing that I think would have made it a disaster isn't just having the group discussion, but what I said before I knew he was pro-choice. Like, if I would have assumed he was pro-life and I would have been in a very grumpy mood, I wonder what if I would have been like complaining or talking badly about pro-choice people or saying something that would have been harmful, would have like reinforced negative ideas he might have had about pro-life people. Does that make sense? I feel like if I would have said different things, it could have gone very badly, and it would have made him uncomfortable and probably solidified the pro-choice perspective more. He's definitely concerned about being a compassionate person and a logical person that has credible facts. So I'm glad I presented myself in the way I would like to be perceived instead of something negative.
You never know who is watching. You never know who is there. We're pretty explicit about that in course. I think I spoke it, but I think Tim wrote this section of script on why we don't want to be talking behind people's backs. It's not just because they might be there, but it also makes you a worse person. But I think like a lot of times it's really easy to be like, nah, I'll know if they're there. And you would know. This is really, really important.
And it's good to not put yourself in bad habits, even in environments where like you are really, really confident it's safe. Because if you're in bad habits, hey, we're all hanging out, it just makes it easier to fall into that later on when it's not as clear.
I'm impressed with how much better both of you are than I am at moving the conversation over to like chairs or the ground or other things. Like you're both, I think, really natural at that, and I struggle with that more, but I think that's really helpful and absolutely something that I picked up on in this story, Rachel. We'll talk more about this in the second episode on this. You didn't bring it up the next time you saw each other. It hasn't like started off as this thing of, all right, well, whenever Rachel and this person's together, then I guess we're talking about abortion. Is like you kind of took it from, all right, we had that interaction and now we're just talking about other stuff and it's fine. There's this natural thing where, sure, it's going to come up sometimes later. It's this important part of your life, but you've been very intentional about not making this the thing that you guys always talk about when you're together.
Yeah, I definitely try to play the long game. I'm not trying to rush into everything and like shove it all on them at once because that's too much for them to hold on to. I'll admit, I really wanted to talk to this guy more about abortion next time I saw him because we didn't really get to finish the conversation 100%. But I had to hold back. That's what felt right to me. And it was a judgment call. I think it was the right one. And I definitely am impatient with that sometimes. So although I try to hold back, it's tempting. It's tempting to only talk about abortion with them, especially if they're like a deep thinker and they have a lot to say and you have a lot to say and all of that.
That's awesome. Well, let me tell you one last story. One of the people that I spent all this time in that private Facebook debate group was a girl named Ronnie. When we first started in this debate group, Ronnie was extremely pro-choice. Thought all pro-lifers are idiots and kind of talked that way and kind of hard to talk to. But for whatever reason, and I have a hard time exactly remembering exactly why, but we did like each other a lot. We genuinely liked each other from the beginning, even though when like talking about abortion, Ronnie had very strong things to say. As we started interacting, I felt like even pretty quickly I was seeing Ronnie's shell crack a little bit. I remember thinking like, all right, well, if anyone changes their minds in this group, one of the three pro-choice people that are the most likely to change their mind, I remember thinking Ronnie was one of those people. Ronnie is this kind of natural intellectual. She's an amazing reader. She's a good thinker, and she would talk about how her ultimate fantasy is being a Supreme Court justice. That was like, if she could be anything in the world, or if she could, be reincarnated and end up being a Supreme Court justice, was the thing that she wanted to be.
Swing for the fences, Ronnie.
I know. So we really enjoyed talking to each other. Ultimately, Ronnie ended up becoming pro-life, but it took years and years. And so I have an article on our blog that links to Ronnie ended up writing a 7 or 8 piece series chronicling her change of mind. And I'm not going to go through all of that, but if people want to read more about the different things that were important for Ronnie, I'll have all of those links under the video and in the MP3 file. But I'm just going to read just a couple of excerpts. One thing that Ronnie said as he was kind of describing being in that Facebook group, he said, I started to call myself on the fence at one point because I came to realize slowly but surely that there were many great pro-life points out there and great pro-life people, even if I didn't realize that my quote-unquote enemies were some of them. There were bad pro-choice arguments, and I'm really glad that the ones who first started pointing these out to me were not the stereotypical hateful pro-lifers / extremists, or at least for her, the stereotypical. She said, I don't know what I would have done if the first people who had pointed out the bad pro-choice arguments were pro-life extremists. No doubt I would have been even more resistant to change than I already was, end quote. So we talked a lot about abortion, but it was, over a year after the Facebook group ended that I actually got to meet her in Wichita, because I was going to Wichita for something. She didn't live that far from Wichita. Clinton Wilcox, a pro-life friend of mine and someone that some people on the chorus might know of, was there as well. And we all got to meet Ronnie at Steve Wagner's house where I was staying. And she later described this as one of the most important milestones to her becoming pro-life. So this is a lot more like the Emily story, I feel like, or at least this part of her story. It's surprising to me even now how significant this night was for Ronnie. But I'll share an excerpt of kind of the way she described. Like, we ended up sitting around Steve's dining room table, all talking about abortion, like you do, And this is what Ronnie said about that time. She said, we all sat in the kitchen / dining area. They were on the same room, and there the real talking began. It was wonderful to be able to be heard. In most online debates, you speak all you want, but your arguments are seldom heard from the opposite side. And if they are, it is mostly so that the opposing side can misconstrue them. For a long time, by that day, I had been mostly asking questions and lurking. Of course, I debate too, but it was mostly on the pages where, again, you weren't really heard. But here these people were, all pro-life, mind you, talking to me, asking me questions. And here's the kicker, actually listening to me. They didn't tell me I was wrong. They didn't call me a murderer. They addressed what I said, asked for clarification, and they let me ask questions, answering every single one I asked. Now, this was a discussion. Their questions were sometimes difficult to answer, though, end quote. So we all are hanging out for a while around Steve's table, and then the plan had been that Clinton and I would take her to Olive Garden, which is her favorite restaurant. So we drove her to Olive Garden. We all sat around Olive Garden eating breadsticks and Italian food, and it was still like talking about abortion basically the entire time. And then she got picked up by her husband. It wasn't long after that she fully came to the pro-life side. She wrote a piece for Secular Pro-Life, and I just love this quotation that she had that kind of described like where she's ended up. She said, "As a woman, I neither need nor want the right to kill humans to be equal as a human being. I am a woman, I am strong, I am capable, I am not inferior, and I don't need the right to kill to be equal." So if people want to read more about her conversion process, she's got 7 or 8 pieces that she's written about that. But when I think about pro-choice friendships that I've had, Ronnie is certainly one of the more significant ones, and we still sometimes talk, and we've met a few times since, and I still care a lot about that person.
Josh, I love that story about Ronnie, and it really is inspiring. But I'm guessing that there might be someone listening to this podcast that's thinking something like, wow, I could never do that. Like, I don't have the patience. I don't have the skill set. How do you do that without getting so angry every time I try to talk to someone that I know personally that's pro-choice? I just get mad. What would you say to them to encourage the fact that, like, yes, we're going to make an argument for why you should do relational apologetics, but maybe say something as to, like, yes, you can actually do this. It's possible. Because obviously it is. You've been through it.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'll say a thing about the angry thing real quick first, and then jump back to the other thing that you asked. When I've had people say, how do you talk to pro-choice people without being angry all the time? I'm always angry when I'm talking to people. One of the things that I've said a lot is you need to become friends with some pro-choice people, because I think it's a lot harder to be constantly angry at someone that you care about. I think I was a lot more of an angry pro-life person before I cared about Ronnie and Jessica and eventually Andrew. And I think like that helped me to become a more virtuous pro-life person, someone who cared more about people who were different than me. And so if you're angry all the time, maybe you're angry because everything that shows up on your Facebook news feed are people who think exactly like you on politics and are posting memes about how stupid the people are on the other side. And that's a problem, and certainly would have a bad effect on me, and I'm intentionally trying not to have that happen. So you might kind of revisit our lesson on confirmation bias, or the podcast that we ended up recording it with some more thoughts on confirmation bias. I think that is going to help people more than a lot of other things with the anger side. And I know Tim might have some other things to add to that. But as far as like I could never do that, I could never, make these arguments as well, or something like that. I'll tell you, like, that's not, I think, usually the decision maker here for people. And again, the psychology of persuasion is super complicated here, and it's impossible to even totally know exactly what's going on for every person who changes their mind. But I've talked a lot to Ronnie specifically, and so I can at least describe what she has described about her own experience. It was so important to her that there were these pro-life people in the group that she could respect as people. And it wasn't just me. It was me, and it was Clinton, and there was another guy named Chris. And all the 3 of those people being good, caring people was important to her, even though I think a lot of times we weren't all being equally persuasive on the philosophy side. Certainly Chris would tell you that he's not as good, or at least wasn't as good at the time, as making rigorous pro-life arguments as what I was doing. But Chris was so helpful being in that group because he was just one of the most loving, humble guys ever. Whenever I think of Chris, I think of humility. Here is someone who would be accused by some of the more difficult pro-choice people in this group of being kind of a bad person or offending them with his arguments. And it was never Chris's fault. It was always their fault. They're being like hypersensitive or whatever. But Chris would always be like so apologetic and so like, I'm really not trying to find you. If there's anything that I said that caused offense, I'm really sorry. Here's what I'm trying to say. He's just a loving person. And Chris was super important to Ronnie's process too. It wasn't just the arguments. And so I think what matters so much more is what kind of a person are you being? Are you a loving, humble, pro-life person? Even if you're sometimes making mediocre arguments, you have so much more effect on most people than the really super philosophically nuanced pro-lifer who's a jerk to people. And we see a lot of that too. And those people don't have as good of an effect on people. So sure, yeah, always work on trying to improve on the argument side. But I care, and I know Tim cares more. We talked a lot about, like, what is it that we care about at ERI? Yeah, ERI is in some ways like an apologetics organization, but we care way more about the people that we churn out, you know, in a sense, than the arguments that they end up making.
That was great. Thank you.
Couple comments. I think if someone's having a hard time not being angry talking with pro-choice people, I think it's possible that they're talking to very, very angering pro-choice people.
That's a good point.
There are people that have a remarkable ability to push my buttons, no matter how much I try to be patient. But I think probably more likely than that, there's a soul level kind of an issue. If you are having a hard time keeping your anger in check, even with real flesh and blood people in front of you, because they have a disagreement, just the fact that they have a political disagreement than you, even one as important as abortion, that sounds like an indication that they need some help with their heart. And if they're not religious, they should find a counselor or someone to help them with their anger management, because something's really not okay. And if they are religious, then they should find a pastor or a priest or a counselor or someone to help them with that. That's not where we want to be.
Yeah, I agree with all that. That's really helpful.
I got a couple questions I want to ask. We've already touched on persuasion psychology a little bit here, but I want to ask a question in that vicinity anyway. I'm interested in both Josh and Rachel answering this question, which is, how has your experience with relational apologetics affected your views about persuasion and why people believe what they believe? So, like, for example, how important did you used to think arguments were for why people believe things? And how important do you think it is now? That's an example of the general question. I don't want you to just answer that question.
Yeah, I certainly, it's the right way to say this. I think I believed before I was doing relational apologetics, I thought that it was almost all about the quality of the arguments. And I very much do not think that now. That's not only because of my friendships with pro-choice people, of course, but
sure.
Absolutely, those friendships have made an impact in the way that I think about arguments and how, as we've talked about today, it's just a lot more complicated. Having someone change their mind is a very, very complicated thing. It's ultimately even too complicated for us to even fully understand, but we can try to get at it. And I certainly know that I was overly simplistic in the way that I used to think about it. And now when I think about it, I think about, like the arguments I think matter. I think it's good to make good arguments and not bad ones, of course. But if my friendships with pro-choice people have affected me on one of these sides, it's affected me more on the side of realizing it matters so much how we treat people. They will remember so much more the way that you treated them than they will exactly what arguments you made.
Rachel?
I think my views about persuasion are the same as when I began my first relational apologetics. I've always thought that it was a combination of the two. You need the not being a jerk friendship relation with the other person, and you need good arguments. But I agree with what Josh said. The way you're making the argument is what's going to make the biggest difference. You're making the argument well, and that means clarity-wise, it means the way you're treating the other person. There's a lot of different aspects that go into it, and each person needs something different. Some people are going to be more intellectually inclined. They're going to want to see the best arguments you have. And then some people are going to be like the story that Emily told with her friend, where they don't even need hardly any arguments, and they're going to change their mind.
One more question, and this is also one I'm interested in both y'all's take on, which is a question that I asked Emily. So we don't want to be results-oriented. These are stories that have good outcomes, at least in general. What kind of mistakes do you think you've made in this process? Or maybe what ways have you grown in learning to do it better?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So certainly one for me, and yes, I have other stories that I could tell about doing relational apologetics where the person doesn't end up pro-life at the end of the story. And I don't have as many helpful lessons that can be gained from those stories. These are not the only important cases. It's not only an important story if the person becomes pro-life, but things that I think in every case where I've spent time doing this, I've come to believe that it would have been better if I could have spent more time engaging, interacting with the person than I have. This has been a real struggle for me, especially in the last couple of years since starting ERI. I am so busy that it's hard for me to invest the kind of time that I would like to be investing into these people. I would like to be talking to these people, if not on a daily basis, on a weekly basis or something like that. And it's with the case of Andrea, like right now it's closer to every 1 or 2 months. And that's not nearly as much as I would like it to be. I'm hoping that changes. You know, ERI is still young, and so all of us are still wearing too many hats that we could give to other people as we grow. And so certainly one of my big kind of long-term hopes is that I get to a place where I'm doing, you know, half the things that I'm doing right now, so I can spend a lot more time investing in people and doing this with a lot more people and trying to learn more lessons that I can try to pass on to other people. So that would be one major one, is not prioritizing enough, not spending enough time with these people.
Rachel?
For me, I would say this is something I need to work on in general when talking about abortion. I definitely don't push hard enough when I have the rapport to push. So I wish that I would encourage the people I talk to be thinking about the issue when we're not talking. Because sometimes when I bring up abortion with Amanda and I say, hey, we were talking about this the other time I saw you, and did you think anything more about it? Usually I kind of get well, I kind of thought about it for a little bit, but I don't know, and blah, blah. I wish that she was a little bit more uncomfortable sitting where she is at. That being said, she's definitely moved to a very refined pro-choice stance. So it's kind of not, I don't know, there's not a lot for her to move on. She's only first trimester case of rape and incest sort of situation. So I wish I would push more. I have a question for you. Do you ever set boundaries or rules with the person that you are dialoguing with, similar to the way that your Facebook group had that set up? Do you ever put up boundaries in a way that's not obnoxious, but can keep the relationship healthy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So not really. I've been doing boundary stuff more lately, again, in some of these more recent attempts that I'm not going to really get into right now. Some of the things I've been experimenting with, being bolder, setting more boundaries when I have to try to keep things healthy. But as far as the part where it's in the Facebook debate group, we had, what we called free forum Fridays, where you're not allowed to talk about abortion on Fridays because we know the objective we want, which is we want to see each other as people and not just avatars. For me, I'm able to accomplish that same thing just without saying it. If I'm in a dialogue or something like that, I can maybe offer some personal information about myself and ask some questions, and maybe one of them is something not abortion related, and just try to kind of model, let's not only talk about this, and try to do that in an organic way without it being kind of all right, for the next 2 emails, we're not allowed to talk about abortion. Let's just talk about other stuff. I don't know, a not weird way to do that, but I think a lot of times you can accomplish certain things if you're being intentional without expressly defining every single thing that you're doing.
Yeah, I basically agree with you, Josh. I think you can set the tone maybe, but you can't set boundaries for the other person. When I'm thinking about my relationships with pro-choice people, I certainly don't make any boundary setting moves, but I do have personal boundaries and personal decisions. Person seems like they are not being very reasonable or open, or starts making cutting remarks or that kind of thing, then at some point I'm going to have to make a judgment call on whether I want to keep on investing time in this, or how much time I want to invest in this. I think I can't even imagine instituting something like the Facebook group Friday rule in a one-on-one relationship. But I'd be really interested if someone has a story about that worked.
Yeah.
I think there should be a certain etiquette that you follow, but it should be unspoken. Name calling and like aggressive side comments that just cut not politely or something, that is unhelpful, and it should kind of be an unspoken two-way street. But setting boundaries in like a very, structured way is probably unnecessary. That's my thought.
Yeah. Okay, this is a pretty long episode, and so let's stop now and kind of pause, and then in the episode that we release in 2 weeks, we're going to spend a lot more time talking not as much stories, but what are some of the reasons that we think it's good for people to do this, and maybe more importantly, what are some practical kind of nitty-gritty tips on how to do this well? What are some of the things that we've learned from our own experiences and things that other people have done that you can kind of take away and try to use this as hopefully you begin trying to have friendships with pro-choice people?